Merci Sarah. Et je suis fier parce que j'ai compris presque tout que tu as dit. Merci à Sarah pour l'invitation et bonjour tout le monde. I am going to give the presentation in English, but you'll see I have some of the slides in French. That's not because I did them. C'est parce que mon ami Tim Aubrey, il me les a donnés. Il a fait les slides in French. Okay? So I'm going to talk with you about Canada's At-Home Chez Soi Housing First project. And this is a project that has ended a couple of years ago. It was for homeless persons with mental illness. And I'm going to talk about moving evidence into policy and practice. So how many people, is this on, Diane? Is this working okay? Oh, okay. Okay. Oh, all right. Okay, sorry. Okay. How many people have heard of At-Home Chez Soi? Okay, almost everyone. So, okay. Well, I'll try to tell you a little bit about the research, and then you can tell me how it has played out here in Montreal. So, the way I've organized this, I'll talk a little bit first about homelessness and housing first, because that's the approach that was studied in At-Home Chez Soi. I'll talk about the At-Home Chez Soi programs and its research, and then the findings, some of the main findings. And I want to have time to talk about scaling out and scaling up housing first across Canada, because just to give you the whole story, this project has had a very big impact in Canada. And I want to talk about that, how it's impacted policy and how it's impacting practice. So this was not just a project that was done and shelved and forgotten about. It's still moving. It still has a lot of energy and is creating a lot of change. So first I'll talk a little bit about homelessness and housing first. So you probably know that homelessness is a big problem in cities here like Montreal and many other cities and rural areas across Canada, where we estimate that there's probably about 60,000 individuals a night who are homeless. And there's also a high prevalence of mental illness and substance abuse or dependence, and those are associated with poorer outcomes for people who are homeless. An important distinction that's been made in this literature is on chronic and episodic homelessness. There's different subtypes of the homeless population. And Dennis Culhane in the U.S., when he was working in a shelter as a graduate student there, he noticed when he went back sometime later that he saw some of the same people, but most of the people that he'd seen before when he was in the shelter were gone. And he asked about them. People had no idea. So what he did is he did a study in which he looked at people and shelter use in New York and Philadelphia, and he found that there's a small group of chronic and episodically homeless who account for most of the shelter days, and they're high users of health, criminal justice, social services. These are the people who end up in emergency room, they end up in hospitals, they're the ones everyone knows who are homeless. Even though they're very small, about 10% of the population of homeless people, they account for the majority of service use. The temporary homeless, on the other hand, are typically have one episode of homelessness. They're in and out very quickly. So Housing First has focused on this particular group of chronically and episodically homeless. And the approach that we studied, this Housing First approach, was developed by a community psychologist named Sam Sambaris, and here's Sam, his smiling face. People seen Sam here before? Anybody seen him? Oh, you have to see him. He's a very popular guy. Whenever I talk to him, he's usually on a headed out somewhere. He's in different countries. This Housing First approach that he developed in New York City has gotten legs, and it's really now being implemented across Canada, the U.S., Europe, many places in the world. So he started out as a street outreach worker with in a psychiatric hospital in New York City, and he started asking people on the streets with mental illness who were homeless what they wanted. They wanted housing. And so he developed this approach for this chronically homeless group based on choice, that people should get what they want. They shouldn't have to jump through a lot of hoops. They shouldn't have to have preconditions. They shouldn't have to be ready to be housed. People are ready already. It's the idea that housing is a right. And so part of that is having rent supplements, because the biggest barrier to getting housing for people is income. These are people who live in poverty, they're homeless, live in poverty, and to get them into housing very quickly. There's also housing and support, and those are separated in the Housing First model. So people get a rent supplement and they get support, and I'll talk about the support in a second. But it's not like they live in a place that looks like a smaller institution in a community where there's a lot of homeless people with mental illness. It's a different approach. It's also a positive approach in that it's focused on recovery. It's not focused on symptoms or illness or deficits. It's focused on the person's potential for recovery and having a life, and on community integration. And it also uses harm reduction approach with people who have substance use issues. So a very progressive approach, and it stood in contrast to this thing that we call sometimes the linear continuum or the staircase model. So here you could see that there's a level of independence on one axis, and on the other, engagement of treatment. And so if people start off homeless, they are not considered ready, so they're in a highly structured environment with a lot of rules, like a shelter. Then maybe they move into, or they're homeless, then they move into a shelter, then they move into some kind of transitional housing, and then permanent housing. And so they have to go through these hoops. Housing First sort of turns this whole approach on its head. With no preconditions, no housing readiness, homeless people go straight into housing right away as quickly as possible. And that's enabled by the support and the rent supplements. So the main thing about Housing First is it's based on the principle of choice. And there's a number of reasons for that. One is just the moral value of consumer self-determination, that people have a right to choose what they want in terms of their treatment support. It also has an empirical basis because it's been shown that about 85% of consumers of mental health services, they don't want to go into a shelter. They don't want to go into transitional housing. They typically don't want to go into a big building. They want to live in their own apartments. And the more choice consumers have, the better are their outcomes. And there's been several studies of this. So this picks up from previous work done in mental health by Paul Carling, where he called supported housing, which is sort of a precursor of this, the choose, get, and keep approach. I choose to live here. The staff help you to get it, and they help you to keep it. And that's a critical issue, is keeping it. So Housing First it's the housing, and it's also the support. And that is typically ACT or ICM. So people know ACT or ICM. Wave your hand if you know a little bit about ACT and ICM. So ACT is a multidisciplinary team, a wraparound service. Services and crisis coverage are available 24/7, and it's got a very low staff to client ratio. Tu as oublié le message de Sarah. It's also designed for people with serious mental illness. That's where it started, is with people who are in psychiatric hospital, typically a state hospital. It started in Madison, Wisconsin, for people with psychoses, schizophrenia, psychotic depression. So these are people with very serious mental illness that oftentimes end up in hospital. Intensive case management is also for people with a number of problems, but probably not quite as severe as those in ACT. They have case managers with caseloads. They do outreach and coordination, and they do a lot of brokering or linking with other services in the community. They don't do it all. The teams are available 12 hours a day, and usually the staff-to-client ratio is higher. So let me tell you about At Home. This is the largest study of its kind anywhere, and there was a lot of money, $110 million for a 5-year study. And the study included both the services that were implemented in 5 cities and the research. And it was an action research project about how to end homelessness. So the design that was used was a pragmatic randomized controlled trial, and that was done in 5 cities, Vancouver, Winnipeg, Toronto, right here, Montreal, Moncton. And it compared housing first versus usual services. So people weren't getting nothing, they had available to them the usual services that people can get in a community. And it was tested at these 2 levels, high needs and moderate needs. So there was kind of a screener that determined the differences, and these groups are quite different. So the high needs group got ACT, and the moderate need group had ICM. Never before had this been tested with ICM. There were also local adaptations. Toronto had an ethno-racial ICM program, and Winnipeg had an Aboriginal ICM program. They also really had all of their programs with an Aboriginal focus, but they said one in particular was geared to Aboriginal people, since that's the majority of the homeless population in Winnipeg. There's a study of, it's a study of outcomes, costs, and implementation. So these are the participants. There's over 2,000, slightly more in housing first than in treatment as usual. Middle-aged, in their 40s typically, about 30% women, average period of time homeless, about 5 years. Many mental health problems. The majority also had some other concomitant health issues. And 90% of them had a variety of other health concerns. So this is a very difficult group. This is the chronically and episodically homeless. So I want to just say a little bit, and we can talk about this when you have the questions. I'll say a little bit about this in the talk today. But unlike a lot of big trials, this had a very strong qualitative component. And that was led by me and Myra Piet here from the Douglas Hospital. And we looked at the conception of the project, how it came into being, how the project was planned at each of the sites, implementation and fidelity. We studied that twice at 2 different time periods. We did consumer narrative interviews, so open-ended qualitative interviews with participants. And most recently, we've done a study of program sustainability and another one now that's just finishing up on scaling out and scaling up. So we did a lot of work along the way in the project. The other thing that Sarah said that you were interested in here in the center was the involvement of people with lived experience. How do consumers become involved and empowered and have a say? Well, that's probably harder in a big trial like this, but it's still doable. And so I'll say just a little bit about how that happened. Well, first of all, you make it your first principle when you put out the request for applications for programs, is you say, you must ensure that people with lived experience of mental illness and homelessness are collaborators in the planning and delivery of all supports and services, and inform the research questions and methods used in the demonstration projects. Well, that was new for a number of the different sites. So they were really on a learning curve. So you have to find ways to make that happen. There's some articles on this in case you're interested on how to involve or how they were involved. And in the beginning in the planning, to be honest, there was quite a bit of variation by site. Some sites did a very good job of involving consumers. Others who were so new at it struggled more. And there was a tight timeline. But there's ways in which the consumers can be concretely included in such a project. They were hired as peer support workers in the ACT teams. They worked as research interviewers at each site. One outstanding example was this People with Lived Experience caucus in Toronto. So Toronto has been doing this consumer participation, psychiatric survivor involvement for many years, and it was pretty easy for them to assemble this caucus, and there's a really interesting article about that. One other thing is that we did in the project is we hired a consumer research consultant. That was Gigi Veronka. Gigi was working on her PhD at the time. She's a postdoc now. And she consulted with each of the sites about how do you involve consumers. So that was a very important strategy. We had specific projects like the Focusing the Frame project in Winnipeg, a photo voice project that was done by consumers. There's a really neat book that the group they made up and they gave me at the end. It was a really nice token, sort of a gift, of all of the photos, and everybody has a quote about their photo that they took of their place. So there's a whole bunch of great ones. I just picked one. So this one, the person talks about their kitchen. I love to cook. On the street, it's hard to get a decent meal. Now my fridge is full, and I can choose what and when I eat. I'm so much healthier now, and I get so much satisfaction in doing something I love to do. I can even invite people over for a meal. Beats the hell out of a food kitchen. Right, really. Other things, the consumers conducted their own research, so Gigi assembled a team, and they did some work on help and what isn't helpful. We had a national working group which was responsible for the whole project, public relations, programs, research, everything. Consumers participated in that. And then if you haven't seen it, the National Film Board put together a production called Here at Home. I was going to show you one clip, but I don't think we have time. But it's great. There's a lot of consumer stories in there, and they're totally unvarnished. People speak very candidly about their Housing First experience or treatment as usual experience. Some really, I urge you to go to that site and you can see it in French or English. What did this project do? Okay, in the interest of time, I'm just going to mention, I won't say anything. We did fidelity assessment. So now when you do any kind of intervention, including a complex community intervention, and you're doing an evaluation of it, it's pretty important to have a fidelity measure to see, is the program actually doing what it intended to do? And so Anna Stefancic and Sam and a group came up with this fidelity scale. It requires a visit, and they went to each site and to each program and spent a day, and they do a lot of interviews and questions, and they come up with, there's 5 dimensions, there's like 38 items altogether. They came up with scores for each of these, and then they feed them back. And it's also a great sort of learning tool because the sites can pinpoint where they're weaker or where they're stronger. In the interest of time, I won't say too much, but the fidelity was very high. Like the highest you could get would be a 4 on these scales, and on most of them, they're at a 4 or above. The one is the tableau de service, that's like service array. Not as great, and that's because it took time for people to develop the brokering relationships with other organizations. So that was, you could see improvement to time too, but at the beginning, that wasn't as good. But still, these were well-implemented programs, all of them. What about housing stability? Well, Housing First compared to treatment as usual has a large impact. Over a period of 24 months, people get rapidly housed. Most of them are housed like more than 75% at the first interval, and that stays pretty similar across. Whereas treatment as usual comes up more gradually. So more than double the number of people are being housed stably. And it looked the same pretty much in every one of the 5 sites. There were also impacts on quality of life and community functioning. You could see these in some of the articles. Now I'll just give you a little taste of the qualitative. So we did these narrative interviews, and we asked people about at 18 months, what kind of changes they had experienced. We interviewed them baseline and then 18 months, and we looked to see what kind of changes. And I think we came up with there were about 15 different changes. So we were just doing kind of a qualitative analysis, and then somebody said, you know, boy, these narratives of the Housing First people, they're way different. They're talking about a lot more change. And so we came up with this idea of coming up with an index, which I'll show you in a second. But here's an example of a positive change. This is the first time, you know, I've had a home. And the first place I feel I love to go home. I feel so safe, and being safe is a major issue for me, you know. This is like what Deborah Paget calls ontological security in her work on qualitative research with the Pathways Group in New York. A mixed or neutral change, that's what life is, because it's like I said, like picking up, losing it all, picking it up, losing it all, picking up, losing it all. So some people were kind of back and forth in their progress and their own life goals, not a straight line. And some people were negative, had negative stories they told. They discharged me to a hotel. I left the next day. It was noisy, bug-infested, full of drugs. And so we quantified this. People on the team told me, we can't quantify this. This is qualitative research. And I said, why not? Let's do it. So we did it. And you can see here that for the Housing First group, more than 60% have a positive change, and then about 30 a mixed change. Hardly anybody talked about negative changes. But look at treatment as usual. It's kind of flat. You know, it's mixed across the three different types of changes. So there's huge impact here when we did it this way. I'll just say something quickly about the cost analysis. This was led by Eric Latimer from McGill. He was the principal investigator for the Montreal site. So we, Housing First with ACT, first of all. So we take an inventory of all the costs of the program, and then all the other costs that are incurred, like people who, they get it, go to hospital. So we had to monetize each of these sort of episodes of service use. For the Housing First with ACT group, it costs about $22,000 a year. But it's about a break even. For every $10 you put in, $9.60 back. So it's pretty much a wash. It's pretty much a break even. These are not as sterling as some of the accounts that have been given, but I think what Eric would tell you is if you look at the better controlled studies, they don't show this cost savings argument as much as you might think. But this is still a good outcome. With ICM, though, it's like that costs $14,000 a year, but for every $10 Canadian invested, ICM saved $3.42. And for the top service users, the top 10%, it saved $21 Canadian for every $10 invested. I don't think we should rely on cost analysis. I think we have a moral argument to make about housing people. But people also listen, policymakers also do listen to these kind of data. So we're glad we had Eric. I want to talk with you now in the last part just about what's happened since the project ended. So scaling out and scaling up. Francis Wesley, Lee and Francis Wesley used systems theory and complexity theory to try to understand social innovation and its diffusion. And they make a distinction between scaling out, which is replicating something in other settings, and scaling up. And that's moving the innovation into a broader system and creating more transformative change. So I'm going to talk about both of those. And when we did our research, we used Abe Wandersman interactive systems framework. And basically there's this whole context around three different systems, interrelated systems. He did this in the context of prevention, that's why that language is in there. But it's all about the delivery system, the support system, and then the synthesis and translation system. And I'll say a little bit about each of those. So for the context, the existing research and theory, we had the findings of the At-Home project. And the climate is, we had a conservative federal government. This was the Harper government in which this was implemented. But it's kind of a curious case because in the U.S., with the Bush administration, there was some take-up of Housing First as well. What we found is we were pushing for sustainability of the project come the project's end, the programs. And when we were doing that, the federal government was reviewing its homelessness partnering strategy, HPS. That's one where the federal government gives money directly to communities, and there's 61 of them, to do something with homelessness. So what had those communities been doing? They did the residential continuum. They funded shelters, street outreach workers, transitional housing, some group settings, maybe some doing Housing First, not too many. They were dissatisfied with hearing that nothing was changing. Homelessness was not being reduced in Canada. What can make a difference? And then we started banging on the door of the Prime Minister's office and saying, this thing is the one that ends homelessness for this chronically homeless group. These are the findings. So in the context of them reviewing this, they decided to change the focus of the HPS. And what they did is for the next couple of years, I think it's for a 4-5 year period, is $600 million went in, and it has to be targeted at Housing First. So for the big 10 communities, 65% has to go into Housing First. And for the smaller communities and the Aboriginal communities, I think it's about 40%. But what's happening is they're all, in spite of some fighting and kicking at the beginning, it's getting taken up. So I'll say a little bit more about that. What about the knowledge synthesis and translation system? Well, we do have peer-reviewed publications, and if you want to know more about that, I can direct you to where you can find those. And that's important for the credibility of the project. But you also have to get stuff out early, and we had technical reports that came out and fancy-looking things that were presented to government even before we did the peer-reviewed publications. And those are really important because people actually read them more than in a journal article. And then we did what I was talking about, integrated knowledge translation with the Prime Minister's office and provincial policymakers. And our group, the qualitative group, put together a Housing First toolkit. Some of our students at Laurier, like Tim McLeod and Rachel Kaplan, did a lot of this work on this. If you haven't seen it, just go online and do Housing First toolkit, and you'll see it. It's available in French and English, as you can see. Here's the French version. So it's all broken down. Here's the overview module. And I just went to points 2 and 3 in the overview. What is the goal of Housing First? Well, we got a Sam doing a TED Talk on Housing First. And that what's the problem? There's all these infographics. It's all online. We didn't print any copies. And people like this, especially when they put together proposals. And finally, we did the support system. We have the support system. And so, in its wisdom, the Mental Health Commission of Canada funded post-project a training and technical assistance program in Housing First. And they hired Sam, who was part of our research team, and our fidelity assessor, and our consultant with each of the sites to do this training and technical assistance. And 18 communities were targeted. So we had people who went through an application process, 18 were selected, and they all got a variety of different trainings. They got at least 2 trainings. They had a fidelity assessment. They did a lot of work with these communities. Now we're into a second phase of training and technical assistance, and that's being picked up by the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. And that's also being done by Sam with a fellow from Alberta named Wally Check. The delivery system is the 61 communities I was telling you about that are funded by HPS. With the shift to Housing First, I already told you about this. So we have a project, and I'm just going to give you kind of just a quick snippet on this because we're almost out of time. But at the same time that the Mental Health Commission did this, I put in a grant proposal to study this impact on practice, and is Housing First being taken up? And so we have a 3-year study. It's just coming to a conclusion. And we did in-depth case studies of 6 of the 18 communities that got the training and technical assistance. And those were Fraser, Saskatoon, Winnipeg, Waterloo, York, and Halifax. Multiple case study approach. We did a training needs assessment at the beginning. We did workshop evaluations. We did fidelity or field notes. We did fidelity assessments. And then we did a bunch of interviews. So those 6 communities they've all made a change. Fraser Valley is some of the suburban area around Vancouver. They've got like 6 or 7 new Housing First programs. And the fidelity ratings are great. I just saw them like a couple of weeks ago. They're fantastic. Saskatoon has a new ICM program, also high fidelity. Really neat staff. And Winnipeg was kind of slow. We went to Winnipeg because they wanted to kind of sustain and expand. Kind of slow off the mark, but then once they pulled together after about a year and a half or so, it just took off. So they have added, they've not only kept their 3 Housing First programs from At Home Chez Soi, they've added 5 new ones. They have a centralized intake, and they have this whole Housing First support team. And this is run by a former student of mine, Shannon Watson. And I just say, go Shannon, go. Go Shannon, go. This is so great to see your former students out there. She's created this thing. There's like 8 staff. She's got a part-time psychiatrist. She's got a social worker, a trauma worker, occupational therapist. Some are embedded with the teams, but they're all available to all of these 8 teams. So they have like their own training and technical assistance. It's cool. It's one of the best models. They talked about it at the Canadian Alliance Conference. Waterloo thought it was doing Housing First, but I said, how many rent subsidies do you have? Rent subsidies? So now they're doing rent subsidies, and another one of our students, Courtney, did her study on the impact of rent subsidies in this Step Home program, and they're huge impacts of the rent subsidies. They've also started a centralized intake through registry. York is in the early stages, struggling a little bit because they don't have the rent subsidies. And Halifax is doing great. They have a brand new ICM program on Housing First. So it took a while to get going, but it's going. So what's happened is, remember the staircase model? This is like, it's flipped on its head. I think what this Housing First approach has done. So now what you do is you start off with permanent housing. Everybody should have permanent housing. And then if for those people, after multiple tries, you step back and you might have some site-specific or service integration, it might be more of a group setting. They did this, for example, in Moncton, where they had some people who just kept getting into difficulties, evicted from their apartments, bringing in friends from the streets, having drug parties, making a lot of noise. And this kept going after, multiple evictions. So what they did is they bought these duplexes. So there's like, I think, 8 units. So there's like 8 single apartments. And one is an apartment for man and woman who are partners, and they have lived experience of homelessness and mental illness, and they kind of watch over. And they have security cameras, and, like they have these, like hotel keys, the slidey things, the cards. So it's working. And some of those people have gone back into their own apartment. But you could go work backwards like this, so you have something more specific, but that's not where you start. You start with everybody having their own place, their own choice, and then after that's not working, you see, what else does this person need? So this is kind of the transformational impact that this program has. So now we're coming to the credits. So I just want to say there's a lot of people who were involved in this project. This was our leader, Paula Gehring. Paula was the chief researcher. She passed away last May. She's a terrific colleague, and we miss her a lot. This is for more information for you. You can go to the Commission website. You can go to the NFB, See Here at Home. You can go to the toolkit, and thank you. Okay.